If you enjoy the content of the 80s Slasher Librarian YouTube channel and would like to sponsor the channel, then see the link in the description below for the Patreon page and start enjoying the benefits of being a patron of the 80s Slasher Librarian. And now the conclusion of the short story, Morte De Freddy, from the book Nightmares on Elm Street, Freddy Krueger's 7 Sweetest Dreams. Following a brief walk along the paths of the university's campus, the two men had come upon a concrete bench near an overhanging cypress tree. Gordon and Curtis sat down upon the bench, settling themselves. Gordon gazed fixedly at Curtis and said, "Tell me what you know about Freddy Krueger." "Only that he was supposed to be some kind of child murderer," Curtis answered. "About 15 or 20 years ago he was arrested and brought to trial. But he was never convicted of any crimes. There's a rumor that after he got released, a vigilante group got together and hunted him down and burned him to death." "The Elm Street parents," Gordon said bitterly. "That's not a rumor. That's just what they did." Curtis pressed his lips together thoughtfully. "Anyway, ever since then he's been a kind of boogeyman figure for the youth of Springwood. They make up nursery rhymes about him, they scare each other. 'Freddy's gonna get ya,' that sort of thing. And now it looks as if every few years he inspires an epidemic of bad dreams, particularly among teenagers. Nightmares so frightening that these kids essentially end up scaring themselves to death." Gordon took some time to let Curtis's answer register. Then he said, "I have to ask you to do something. I want you to try and not have any preconceptions about what I'm about to tell you. You got to keep an open mind, all right?" Curtis nodded. "First of all, you have to understand that Freddy Krueger is real. He's not a figment of anybody's imagination or anything like that. He's as real as you or me." "To the kids, you mean, don't you?" said Curtis. Gordon shook his head. "What I'm saying is Freddy Krueger exists. Literally exists." Curtis frowned, mystified. But Gordon continued. "Back when I was at Weston Hills, I had a situation that was similar to the one you're in right now. I had these 7 kids, all of whom were certain that Freddy was trying to kill them in their dreams. I tried all the conventional treatments, hypnosis, primal scream therapy. For a while I even considered electroshock. I was that desperate. Then one day a grad student who was at the hospital working on a research project came up and introduced herself to me. Her name was Nancy Thompson." "I saw that name in your notes," Curtis said. "I haven't had any luck tracking her down, though." "That's because she's dead," said Gordon. "Freddy Krueger killed her." The two of them were silent for a time, Curtis waiting for the other man to resume. Finally, Gordon said, "Nancy's father was one of the higher-ups in Springwood's police department. He also happened to have been the leader of the vigilante group that burned Krueger to death. When she was 17 years old, Nancy and a few of her friends were the first ones to start having these nightmares about him. A couple of them died, too. Nancy ended up spending months institutionalized herself, though she got better. She moved away from Springwood, and she probably wouldn't have come back if it weren't for my kids." Curtis asked, "How'd she know about what was going on with your kids?" "The same way that I knew about Gail Milliken," Gordon answered. "She saw them in a dream." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, steepling his fingers. He spoke quietly, without looking at Curtis. "As far as I know, I'm a unique individual. I'm the only adult who's ever had recurring nightmares of Freddy Krueger. I thought they were over with a long time ago, but when they started up again last month, that's when I called John Pace and had myself committed." He turned to Curtis. "When you're sleeping and you start to dream, you enter Krueger's world. He's king there. He controls everything. He can manipulate you any way he wants. He likes to toy with his victims, torment them a little bit at a time, and then finally he kills them. The only problem is, if you die in your dreams, you die in the real world too." Curtis was shaking his head with disbelief. Assuming this dream stuff has some credibility, and you've got to admit that's a hell of an assumption, Gordon. The question is why? Why does he do it? Is he just psychotic or what? Gordon weighed his answer carefully. Freddy Krueger was a man who led a terrible life, virtually from the moment of his conception. His mother, Amanda, wasn't much older than a teenager herself at the time. She'd been doing volunteer work at a hospital for the criminally insane. Just by coincidence, on the very same grounds where Weston Hills went up later. The same place you're working at right now, Curtis. One Friday night, over Christmas weekend I think it was, she accidentally locked herself in a ward with scores of some of the most insane, evil, inhuman beasts you could imagine. They kept her prisoner for 3 days, hiding her from the skeleton crew that manned the hospital over the holiday weekend. For 72 hours, those animals took turns torturing her and raping her. When she was finally rescued on Monday morning, she was in a state of catatonic shock. She was also pregnant. "My God," Curtis whispered. "Freddy? The bastard son of 100 maniacs." Gordon paused to take a breath. There wasn't any question in Amanda's mind that she'd have the baby. She was a devout Catholic after all. So an abortion was impossible. Immediately after Freddy was born, she put him up for adoption. Then she went off and joined a religious order. She entered a convent where she spent the rest of her life praying for Freddy's immortal soul. "What happened to him?" asked Curtis. "He grew up in an orphanage. A problem child, if you will. Unwanted, unloved. No doubt physically and emotionally abused. He carried the stigma of his birth with him throughout his whole life, like an albatross around his neck. By the time he was an adult, he'd become a brooding loner, a pariah to the rest of the community, the obvious suspect in a series of heinous crimes. An entire community looking to lynch him after the evidence against him failed to convince a jury that he was guilty. Attacked by a vengeful mob and roasted alive." Gordon looked at Curtis pointedly. "I'd say if ever a spirit had call to be restless, Krueger's would. Wouldn't you?" Curtis then asked. "The rest of the kids, besides Nancy, I mean, they were from Elm Street too?" Gordon nodded. "My 7 kids, each of them had a parent who was part of the mob that killed Freddy Krueger." Curtis muttered grimly. "Good God," Gordon then said. "It turned out, though, that one of the kids, a girl named Kristen Parker, I'm sure I must have mentioned her in my notes." "I remember the name," Curtis interjected. "Kristen had a special power, you see," Gordon continued. "One that I've since learned to use myself. She could pull other sleepers into her dreams. One day, Nancy and I conducted a group session with the kids, an experiment in mass hypnosis. All of us went under, including me. We all went into Kristen's dream. Together." He paused. "That's when I met Freddy." "You actually saw him?" Gordon nodded slowly. "I helped the kids as best I could, but they were the ones who really battled him. Later on, when Amanda, she had Nancy's father and me dig up Freddy's bones and bury them in holy ground." Curtis then said incredulously, "You mean Amanda Krueger was still alive?" Gordon shook his head. "Not exactly." He frowned. "That part's not important right now. What happened is that once they were in the dream world, Nancy and a couple of the kids didn't make it out. But some of the others survived. Kristen, Joey Caulfield, Ronald Kincaid. I thought it was over for good, but it wasn't long before Freddy came back." "What do you mean?" "A couple of years ago, after I'd moved to Florida, I got a letter from a girl in Springwood named Alice Johnson. She told me that Freddy had returned and that he'd killed Kristen and Joey and Kincaid. But she said she'd managed to take care of him herself. She was absolutely sure that he was finished once and for all." Curtis scowled. Obviously she was wrong. Gordon then grunted. "Obviously." Curtis leaned back against the bench, He looked up at the clear blue sky, digesting what the other man had told him, wanting badly to believe Gordon. If only the story weren't so damned fantastic, he said to himself. He brought down his eyes again as Gordon was saying, "What I've been doing while I'm here is trying to figure out a way to rid the universe of Freddy Krueger forever. That's been the problem, ever since the beginning, going back to Nancy. You can stop him temporarily, but he always comes back." So Curtis asked, "Do you have something in particular in mind, Dr. Gordon?" Gordon locked his eyes onto Curtis's. "What do you know about time traveling?" Curtis's expression became dubious. "You mean like in H.G. Wells?" Gordon shook his head. "I mean through hypnosis. Do you know much about that?" "Very little," Curtis admitted. "I've read some stuff on past life regression. Not that Shirley MacLaine mumbo-jumbo, but a couple of monographs in the Journal of American Psychiatry." He frowned, thinking hard. "Isn't there somebody in California who's done a lot of work on this subject?" "Finney, Matheson, and Russ at Berkeley," said Gordon. "It turns out that they've gone a lot further, though. Further than what they've let come out in print, anyways. It also happens that I'm friends with 3 of them. They've shared a lot of their unpublished work with me. Believe me, they're into some very interesting research." "But what's that got to do with Freddy Krueger?" Curtis asked doubtfully. "What were you thinking about? Like what, going back in time and stopping his mother from locking herself up in a ward full of psychopaths? And what, thereby keeping him from being born?" "That's not something we can do," Gordon answered tersely. "We can't change history." "Then what exactly did you have in mind, Gordon?" "Something else." Gordon looked away for a moment, as if to gather his resolve, then turned back to Curtis. "I've reached the conclusion that there's only one person who's powerful enough to permanently eradicate Freddy Krueger." Curtis looked skeptical. "And who exactly might that be?" he asked, unable to keep the edge out of his voice. "Freddy himself," Gordon said. Neil Gordon flew back to Springwood with Dr. Curtis. During the trip, Gordon filled in as much as he could about his involvement with the original Elm Street children. He told Curtis about the mysterious nun who had entrusted him with the secret of Freddy Krueger's origin, a nun who may or may not have been the spirit of Amanda Krueger herself. Gordon also told how he and Nancy Thompson's father had followed Amanda's instructions to defeat Freddy by burying his mortal remains in consecrated earth, and how Mr. Thompson had lost his own life in the process. Recently, Gordon had come to understand that any similar type of defeat for Freddy Krueger was equally transitory. He now believed that no single human being or group of human beings could destroy Krueger. Because of the peculiar metaphysical nature of Freddy's evil persona, said Gordon, the only thing that could obliterate his existence would be a true alter ego. Just as matter in the physical universe is destroyed by antimatter, so could Freddy be destroyed only by an anti-Freddy. Gordon then explained carefully to Curtis his theory as to how an anti-Freddy could be, must be, created. He showed Curtis several volumes of notes on the time travel experiments of Doctors Finney, Matheson, and Russ in California. As Curtis studied the detailed information, he was taken aback when he realized he was starting to believe that Dr. Gordon's incredible proposition was not only plausible, but could succeed. The realization of that belief, he decided, was profoundly unsettling. According to the notes, it was indeed possible to hypnotize a subject and send him or her back in time. The procedure was delicate, but not especially complicated for a trained hypnotherapist to perform. According to Gordon, a subject under deep controlled hypnosis could actually integrate himself or herself into the past and interact with people who had lived or died long ago. "I thought you told me we couldn't change history," Curtis countered. "Wouldn't interacting with the past just do that?" Gordon explained that his friend's work indicated that once a time visitor became a part of the past, it was no longer our past. Imagine it this way, he said. Assume that the laws of physical reality that operate our universe are consistent with the laws of all other possible universes, parallel universes. Because the laws are the same, then the differences between the universes are comparatively small. Consequently, there is an extremely large but finite number of possible universes. Then assume that every human being who's ever existed in our universe has a counterpart, in at least one, but not necessarily every other parallel universe. Think about some moment when you made a decision that literally turned your life around. Somewhere in some other universe that up to that point in history was exactly like ours. The Andy Curtis of that world went the other way. Not only was his life changed, but so were the lives of everyone he's encountered since then. His decision has, in effect, changed his entire world, which from that moment of decision forward is different from ours. That's what I mean when I say we can't change history, Gordon continued. When someone from our world goes into the past, it's not really a straight line of travel. You move on a diagonal, by just a fraction. You're going back into a world that up to that point of your arrival has been exactly the same as the world you left. But your arrival changes that world the instant you appear. That's why the paradoxes we usually associate with time travel don't apply. You can't go into your own past and kill your father before you're born, so that then you'll cease to exist. All you'll have done is prevent some other Andy Curtis in some parallel world from being born, you see? The two of them had fallen into silence after that, and Curtis resumed studying the notes. In the back of his mind, he began to go over the particulars of Gordon's plan for dealing with Freddy Krueger. This, Curtis told himself sardonically, was where things looked to get a little dicey. What Gordon had in mind was something that had never occurred to his Berkeley friends to attempt. I'm in too deep to turn back now, though, Curtis thought. In terms of conventional accepted scientific wisdom, much of what had happened in the past week was impossible to explain. The shared nightmares of the kids at SMHC, the parallels to incidents that occurred half a decade ago, Gail Melican's bizarre death, Gordon's telephone call in the middle of the night, the whole ghastly tale of the life and times of Freddy Krueger. Much to his surprise, Curtis found himself thinking that Gordon's explanation as to the hows and whys of it all, as well as his theory as to the manner in which they could bring about Krueger's ultimate demise, was beginning to make sense. It was nightfall by the time he set down the notes, just as the final leg of their flight was descending into Springwood. He looked over at Gordon, sitting beside him in a window seat. Gordon was staring contemplatively at the twinkling lights of the city rushing toward them. "I never thought I'd be coming back here," Gordon said. He turned to Curtis and saw the closed file. Curtis asked him, "So what's our first move, Gordon?" "A test," Gordon answered. "We go to the place I told you about, the abandoned tower on the old hospital property. That place is where Amanda was." Gordon's voice trailed away. His look became contemplative again. "Then what?" Curtis said. "Then you put me under. And then we find out if it's truly possible to go back to the moment of Krueger's conception." "Uh-huh," Curtis said firmly. "You put me under. I'm the one who's making the trip?" Gordon shook his head. "You don't know how dangerous Krueger can be." "I also don't know the hypnosis technique as well as you do," Curtis cut in. "I can't guarantee I'll be able to bring you back once I've put you under." "I can't let you do this," Gordon said emphatically. "I can't allow you to take that risk. Gail Melican was my patient, remember? You don't have any patients anymore, Dr. Gordon. They're all dead." Gordon's expression became pained. Curtis realized that he had wounded him badly. Neither man spoke for a moment until Curtis said in a more gentle voice, "Look, Neil, I'm not trying to pull rank on you. Honest to God. We're together in this, you and me. But you're not the one who's chancing his career this time. I am." He paused, then added, "Besides, I want to go back." The jolt of the airplane's wheels touching down momentarily startled Gordon. He turned abruptly to look out the window, calmed himself, then turned back to Curtis. "I'm the one who goes under," Curtis said. "All right?" At last Gordon nodded. "Whatever you say, Curtis." After collecting Gordon's suitcase from a baggage carousel, they took Curtis's Mazda, which he'd left in the airport's short-term parking lot, back to the Springwood Mental Health Clinic. Curtis had suggested that they stop at his apartment first to drop off Gordon's bag and have a bite to eat, but Gordon was far too anxious to begin the experiment. Now that he was this close to Krueger, he said, he wanted to get on with what they planned to do as soon as possible. They arrived at SMHC shortly after 10:30 p.m. Curtis paused at the entrance gate to show his ID to the night guard, then wheeled through the gate, turning onto the outer drive that circumscribed the 6 acres that made up the center's grounds. The decrepit, tumble-down, abandoned asylum lay at the rear of the grounds. It was a third of a mile from the brightly lit, modern structures that comprised the center's current facility. During the day, Curtis could see the old asylum from his office window. The building was encircled by a grove of elm and oak trees that stood like sentinels. He had never had an urge to explore the old building. He'd heard a report, never officially acknowledged, that the asylum had been condemned by the city. However, it wasn't lack of curiosity or fear of injury that kept Curtis and virtually everyone else away. It was a miasma that seemed to enshroud the place, making it seem resolutely inhospitable and uninviting. Curtis pulled to a stop along the concrete turnabout in front of the dark building. He noticed that here the concrete of the drive was badly cracked, in a state of disrepair, as extreme as that of the asylum itself. Wordlessly, Gordon opened the door on his side and got out of the car, carrying with him the canvas duffel bag he'd brought from Florida along with his suitcase. Curtis paused to reach underneath his seat for the foot-long mag-light flashlight he kept there. He switched on the light, comforted by the feel of its solid, heavy bulk in his hand, then got out of the car to follow the other man. They moved toward the east wing of the asylum and a high tower, almost like a church steeple, whose peak overlooked the circular turnabout. Gordon walked purposefully as if he knew exactly where he wanted to go, and Curtis had to trot to stay on his heels. They entered the building through a broken door that led into a small vestibule. Gordon pointed toward a narrow flight of stairs, the apex of which disappeared into blackness. "This way," he said. He led Curtis up 10 flights of stairs. By the time they reached the top level, Curtis was gasping for breath. Gordon kept on going, making his way down a short corridor that ended at a wide wooden door. He turned the handle and pushed the door, but it would not budge. He motioned for Curtis to help him. The two of them pressed their shoulders against the solid wood, pushing mightily. They were able to force the door open. Its hinges groaned with resistance. They stepped through the doorway and found themselves standing upon a kind of balcony behind a waist-high wooden railing. Curtis moved to the railing, shining his flashlight down into a huge open expanse of floor 30 feet below. Littering the expanse was pieces of broken furniture and piles of trash and other debris, the detritus of years' unuse. "What is this place?" Curtis asked, keeping his voice low. "This was where they kept the most violent inmates," Gordon replied, his tone undercut with acrimony. "Where we're standing used to be a gallery for visitors. From up here they could watch the lunatics and not have to worry about being accosted." He shook his head. "The middle of the 20th century, and it was just like Bedlam. A fucking snake pit." Curtis then said, "And this is where Amanda Krueger?" Gordon's jaw was clenched. He looked at Curtis, his eyes alight with cold fire. "Let's get to work," he said. They searched the gallery for makeshift furniture. Curtis found a pair of wooden boxes, one of which was a bit more sturdy than the other. He carried the boxes back to Gordon, handing over the less sturdy of the two. Gordon stood the box on one end. He opened his duffel bag and took out a device that looked like a metronome, a silver ball that hung from the end of a pendulum. He positioned the device on top of the box. Curtis had taken the other box and laid it lengthwise on the floor, open side down. He sat down, settling himself as comfortably as possible. He handed his flashlight to Gordon. "You've been hypnotized before?" Gordon asked. Curtis nodded. "Good. Since you've read the procedure, you know it's basically the same as ordinary hypnosis. It's just that once you're under, the suggestions I'll be giving you will be different from the kinds of hypnotic suggestions you're used to." "I understand," Curtis said. "Okay," Gordon began. "Just relax." He reached for the silver ball and set the pendulum in motion. He shined the flashlight on the ball, narrowing the beam of light so that the ball was passing back and forth from brightness to shadow. "Watch the ball, Andy," he uttered. His voice was soft and soothing, commanding and irresistible all at the same time. "Just watch the ball and relax. Let your mind go." Curtis then whispered to himself, "Let your mind go." And that quickly he was hearing Gordon's voice and not hearing it any more. "Let your mind go. I'm under. Floating. Feel everything floating. Must have been so susceptible because I'm so damn tired. Jesus, what an unbelievably long day this has been. And where am I now? What the hell is going on? Go back." Must be Gordon. I can still hear his voice. Can't really understand what he's saying. Still going back. Still floating. Keep floating. Feels like hours and hours. Keep going. Keep. Open your eyes, Andy. Going. I'm there. Still here in the asylum, only it's then, not now. Getting up, standing, going to the rail. Looking over the rail, and what the Christ is going on down there? That woman must be Amanda. Oh my God, I hear her screaming, those maniacs. What they're doing to her, but that's all the sound I can hear. Anybody else is so quiet, just her screams. Won't somebody help her, please? Those maniacs, gotta stop them. Stop, you bastards. Stop, stop, stop. "Wake up, Andy." "Who's calling me?" Gordon shouted. "Andy, wake up!" Curtis's eyes snapped open. He was on his feet, leaning over the gallery railing. Gordon's arms were wrapped around him tightly, pulling him back. An intense sensation of vertigo washed over him. His legs became rubbery and he sank to the floor. Gordon let him slide down, then was kneeling beside him. It took Curtis a moment to focus his eyes on Gordon's expression of deep alarm. "Andy, are you all right?" Curtis's reply was a hoarse croak. What happened?" "You'd been under for about a minute or so when all of a sudden you let out this wail. Right before you made a jump for the railing. For God's sake, what did you see?" A minute?" "Yeah." Curtis shook his head with defiance. "I was there for hours." He could feel the dizziness coming over him again, and the edges of his vision sparkled. He clutched Gordon's forearm, his fingers digging into flesh, pulling the man close. "I was there," Curtis hissed. "Neil, I was there." And then he fainted. Gene Chandler slept intermittently that night, disturbed by fitful thoughts of Andy Curtis. Conflicting emotions roiled inside her. Concern, anger, apprehension, indecision, doubt, and guilt. What he's doing is wrong, she told herself over and over, unconvincingly. They may have the best intentions in the world, but damn it, they're going about it all wrong. At midnight, Chandler had received a phone call from Neil Gordon, asking her if she could come over to Curtis's apartment right away. When she arrived 20 minutes later, the first thing she saw was Curtis. He was sitting on the sofa opposite the front door, looking drawn and deathly pale. Gordon had been the one to let her into the apartment because Curtis was too weak to get up and answer the door himself. She had rushed to Curtis's side and sat down close to him. She worried over his wan expression and enervated condition. She listened as he described his trip through time to the horrifying moment of Freddy Krueger's conception. He and Gordon then took turns explaining to her what they intended to do, come morning, after Curtis had had time to rest, and how they wanted her to help them. At that point she had asserted, "You can't be serious about this. You're asking me to help you kidnap a patient for some cockamamie experiment that you're not even sure will work. You've got to go to Lloyd and tell him what you're doing." Gordon had been standing near the front door the entire time. "We can't do that," he said. "I know Lloyd Mayfield. He'll never give us his permission." Curtis looked at Chandler. "Neil's right. Lloyd'll never go along with this. Freddy Krueger's our responsibility." "Freddy Krueger is dead," Chandler snapped. "He's not dead," Curtis said stubbornly. "Good Christ, Gene. Haven't you been hearing what we're telling you?" "What I heard was some cock-and-bull story about hypnotically induced dreams you had that you went back 40 years in the past." "Damn it, I was there. I saw Amanda Krueger." Chandler was shaking her head in dismay. "Andy, I don't know what to say to you." She looked from Curtis to Gordon. "Will you both try and think rationally for a moment about what you're doing? Just try." Gordon then said softly, "Dr. Chandler, either you help us or you don't. We're going ahead with what we've got planned. What happened to Andy tonight demonstrated to us that it's more risky than we thought. We could really use your help." "But even if you don't help us," Curtis said, "we're going to do it anyway, on our own." Curtis and Gordon watched her closely, awaiting her response. She looked from one man to the other and shook her head. "I just can't get involved in this." Gordon then said, "Can you at least promise not to tell Lloyd what we're doing?" "I don't know," said Chandler. "I honestly don't know." She turned to Curtis and took his hand in hers. "Andy, please, I'm begging you. Take a few days to think about this." "I can't," he said. "It has to be done as soon as possible, before Krueger can harm anyone else." Chandler let go of his hands and turned away from him. After a moment she arose from the sofa. Without a word she gathered the coat and handbag she'd brought with her, crossed to the front door, and left the apartment. An hour later she lay in her own bed thinking, "I have to tell Lloyd." But that would mean betraying the man she loved, she told herself. Curtis would certainly be censured, if not dismissed outright from the hospital staff. His reputation would be ruined if he didn't lose his license to practice medicine altogether. Not to mention that what they're doing is dangerous. Her heart ached as she recalled how awful Curtis had looked, as if he'd been through an incredible ordeal that drained him not only emotionally, but physically. What was it that Neil Gordon had said? That Andy had been under for barely 60 seconds, and that tomorrow they planned to leave him under for 20 or 30 times that long? They must be insane. I have to stop them. I have to tell Lloyd. I don't know what to do. She gave up trying to get any rest shortly after sunrise. After showering and dressing for work, she went into her apartment's small kitchen and made herself a meager breakfast. On the wall near her refrigerator hung an extension to the telephone in the bedroom. She stared at the extension for some time, trying to make up her mind whether or not she should call Curtis. "What do I say to him?" she asked herself. She didn't have an answer. She decided not to call. Chandler arrived at SMHC at 8:30. She went into the staff lounge and was grateful to find it deserted of any of her colleagues. She checked her mailbox for messages, then poured a cup of coffee from the lounge's antique Mr. Coffee machine near the door. She sat down in one of the armchairs that furnished the room. Unable to take her mind off of Andy Curtis, she glanced at his mailbox and saw that it was stuffed with several days' worth of communications. She felt a small twinge of relief, hoping that this was a sign that he hadn't been in yet. Maybe she could keep an eye out for him and speak to him again before he and Gordon... The door opened. Chandler perked up hopefully for a moment, until she saw that it was Jerry Butler. Butler was wearing her customary sour expression as she closed the door behind her. She glowered hello to Chandler, then went to the coffee machine. As she was pouring herself a cup, Butler said to Chandler, "You wouldn't have any idea why Andy Curtis checked out one of my patients without asking me, would you?" Chandler could feel icy fingers tickling the back of her neck, so she said warily, "I'm sorry?" Butler turned to her. He signed out one of my patients early this morning. A boy named Harvey Baker?" Chandler sensed the blood draining from her face. Butler said, "Jean, are you all right?" She cautioned herself to stay calm. "I'm sorry, Jerry," she said. "I wouldn't have a clue what Andy's up to." "Believe me," Butler said, "I intend to ream his ass when I see him. Where the hell does he get off snatching one of my kids without okaying it with me first?" Chandler had come to her feet. She was trying to keep the bland expression on her face cinched tight as she crossed to the door. "I'm sure he's got a good reason for doing whatever it is he's doing." She pulled open the door. "If I see him, I'll tell him you're looking for him." Butler grunted, but before she could say anything more, Chandler was out the door. Fighting to maintain control, Chandler moved determinedly through the hospital's halls. She made her way toward the rear of the main building, exiting through back doors that opened onto a wide expanse of manicured lawn. The grove of trees that separated SMHC from the old asylum lay just ahead of her. Once outside, she broke into a jog. By the time she reached the trees, she was running as hard as she could. The heels of her shoes loudly clacked on the cracked concrete of the turnaround in front of the ruined building. She paused for a moment, trying to remember what Curtis had said last night about which part of the building he and Gordon had visited. She stood still momentarily until she heard Curtis's voice crying out in abject terror from the upper reaches of the east tower. Chandler dashed across the turnaround and pushed her way through the broken doorway. She raced up the narrow stairway, reached the top landing, and ran down the short hallway to the door at the end. The door was open. She burst through the doorway of the dilapidated gallery and froze, chilled at the sight of the bizarre tableau before her. Two straight-backed wooden chairs, one occupied by a sleeping teenage boy, the other by Andy Curtis. Neil Gordon was crouching beside Curtis, shaking him vigorously. Curtis's face was a mask of horror, his eyes wide open and staring blankly into space, his lips skinned back, teeth bared, a blood-curdling cry of terror shredding his throat. His dark hair had turned snow white. Chandler cried at Gordon. "What have you done to him?" "He's trapped in the dream world," Gordon cried back over his shoulder. "Please help me. I can't wake him up." Dr. Andrew Curtis in the dream world. How did I get here? Remember the hospital. Ask for Harvey. Take him. Everything's okay, just an experiment. I'm Dr. Curtis. This is Dr. Gordon. Go to the tower, Gordon. Put both of us under Harvey's afraid. No, don't want to dream about Freddy. But Gordon says it's all right. All right, Dr. Curtis. We'll be with you. I go under, same as last night. Materialize in the gallery this time, run down the stairs, unlock the ward, race to save Amanda. Who are you? Who are you? I tell her. I'm Dr. Curtis. I'm just visiting the asylum, Amanda says. You saved my life. I rescue her, watch her stay with her. Practice work at the asylum. She's pregnant. We go out together. Amanda, will you marry me? Will you marry me? I don't care whose baby. It's our baby. Our baby. She then says, Yes, I'll marry you, Andy. I love you. The baby comes. It's a boy. We name him Frederick after Amanda's father. Call him Fred, not Freddy. Raise him as my son. Amanda and I are man and wife. Watch Fred grow up a fine boy. My son, our son. We love him so very much. A bright, inquisitive boy. Loving Amanda takes him to church. An altar boy, the most devout young man I've ever known, comes to me after high school graduation and says, Dad, I'm thinking about becoming a priest. Goes to the seminary. Father Frederick Krueger. Curtis, a fine man, a good man, a parish priest, beloved by his congregation. Years and years pass on, and Fred's 40th birthday, Amanda having passed away a few years ago. Both of us sad, losing her, but that was years ago. I'm 72 years old, and I call him up. Fred, it's me. I've got something to talk to you about, something that's going to be very hard to believe, but you must believe me. Tell him the story of Freddy Krueger in the real world, the other world where I come from. All those years ago, Tell him he must save the other world from Freddy. You're the only one who can do that, Fred. Only you. Father Fred Curtis. He looks at me with astonishment and he says he has to pray, has to think about it. I believe you, Dad. Then says to me, I'm ready. Curtis calls out to Dr. Gordon. We're ready. Gordon replies, I'm sending you into Harvey's dream. And Fred and I feel ourselves pulled into a vortex. Bright colored lights like the inside of a kaleidoscope, a swirling tunnel of light. Then I hear screaming, my God, it's the boy Harvey. This place, some kind of warehouse, like a Caligari nightmare with barrels. Oh my God, there at the end, Freddy Krueger. We're in Harvey's dream, my son Fred and I, and Freddy, his face horribly burned, his eyes like Fred's, but not. Oh, Fred's finger knives flashing. Fred is right beside me. Freddy has the boy by the hair, dunking him into a barrel, drowning him. Harvey screams, sloshing over the barrel, smells like whiskey, awful smell. And Harvey is sputtering, choking. Fred shouts to Freddy, stop! Freddy turns, sees Fred. The two of them like looking into a funhouse mirror, distorted versions of one another. Fred is anti-Freddy and Freddy is anti-Fred. The look of terror in Freddy's eyes. He knows Fred recognizes my son. Oh, he runs towards Freddy. I cry out desperately, no, Fred, no! Knowing what he intends to do, my son. Don't sacrifice yourself. But Fred catches Freddy, embraces him, and Andy, please wake up! Who? Andy, please wake up! Jean, that sounds like Jean's voice, but how? How could it be? Andy, please! Can't listen to her now. Must help Fred first. But too late. He embraces Freddy and there is an explosion. Matter and antimatter. They blow each other to bits. No more Freddy and no more Fred. I cry out again. My son, my son. But must help Harvey. Help the boy. I've got him. Andy, wake up now. It's over. It worked. I can wake up. Curtis opens his eyes. Sees Gordon with Harvey Baker. The boy is awake now also and sobbing. Gordon hugs the boy saying, shh, shh, Harvey, it's all over now. Freddy can't hurt you anymore. Seeing Jean Chandler and thinking, why is she looking at me like that? Then looking down at his hands resting on the arms of the chair. Seeing the backs of his hands, the wrinkled skin and dark spots and raised blue veins, and understanding with horror what's happened to him, and his relief changing to a feeling of wanting so very badly to scream. Several hours later, Dr. Andrew Curtis lay in bed in his private room at the Springwood Mental Health Center. Outside, the sun had just begun to sink beneath the western horizon. The imminent sunset had filled the room with shadows. Curtis lay in bed, imagining the condescending voices of his colleagues. It's the most astounding thing I've ever seen. Accelerated premature senescence. Like some bizarre kind of adult progeria. He's 32 years old, for heaven's sake, and suddenly he's got the body of a 70-year-old man. How could that have happened? I just saw him 3 days ago and he was fine. Same old Andy. Same old Andy. Old Andy. Old. After he and Harvey Baker had returned from the dream world, Jean Chandler and Neil Gordon had brought them to the center. The boy was fine. Because of a post-hypnotic suggestion planted by Gordon, Harvey had no memory of what had happened in the tower of the old asylum. He had no memory of having been in the tower at all. By that afternoon, there had begun to circulate an official story devised by Gordon and Chandler and Lloyd Mayfield. The story went this way. Gordon was a friend of Dr. Curtis visiting from Florida. He had awakened that morning and discovered Curtis in his present inexplicable condition. Knowing of Curtis's relationship with Dr. Chandler, which was no longer a secret from the rest of their colleagues, Gordon telephoned her at the center. She ordered him to drive Curtis there immediately, promising to meet them in the staff parking lot. It was while waiting for Gordon and Curtis that she found Harvey Baker wandering near the parking area. The boy seemed to be in a fugue state. He had no recollection of having forged Dr. Curtis's signature on his sign-out sheet, which is what must have happened, as no one admitted to having seen Dr. Curtis on the grounds until Dr. Chandler and Dr. Gordon brought him in. Not once did anyone mention the name of Freddy Krueger. Curtis had spent the day being poked and prodded and processed by Dr. Gooden, SMHC's resident geriatrician. An hour ago, Gooden had told Curtis that he was indeed what he appeared to be, a man who had literally aged 40 years overnight. While Curtis's laboratory tests were being processed, Gooden ordered him to bed, prescribing a sedative to help him sleep. The prescription was a mild one, because among his other new physical problems, Curtis demonstrated symptoms of severe cardiovascular degeneration. Too strong a sedative could kill him. "Perhaps something in the lab test will give us a clue as to why this happened," Gooden suggested, "and what we can do about it. There's always hope, Andy." But Curtis was still enough of a physician to read in his colleague's eyes that there was no hope. None at all. "I'm old." He'd seen the expression on Jean Chandler's face when she'd watched him being gurneyed into his room and lifted into his bed by a pair of nurses. They'd lifted him as easily as if he'd been a bundle of dry sticks wrapped in parchment. The nurses left and Jean came to the bed, and he could see the look of repulsion that she tried hard to disguise. "Neil would like to talk to you," she had said, and it occurred to him that she had never used Gordon's first name the night before. He sent her away, refusing to see anyone. He lay in bed now, alone in the room, waiting for the sedative to do its work and slumber to take him. "So this is the price I pay," Curtis said to himself. 40 years, my entire adult life, gone. Was it worth it, Andy? He wondered. Was it worth it to rid the world of Freddy Krueger once and for all? A voice spoke to him softly from out of the deepening shadows in the corner of the room. "No, it wasn't." Curtis thought, "I didn't hear anybody come in." "That's because I was already here." "I must be dreaming." "Who's there?" Curtis asked. His old man's raps quivered. "Who's there?" "A friend," the voice replied. "Somebody who's here to tell you the truth." Curtis propped himself up on matchstick arms. He peered into the shadows. His vision was dim, but he thought he could make out an indistinct figure shape in the gloom. "Neil Gordon lied to you," the voice said. "He told you he'd given you all his notes on time traveling, but he left out the ones about how time gets compressed when you dream. However many years you spend in the dream past, once you get back to the real world, your body will show it. He knew about it all along." Curtis then hissed, "Who are you?" The figure in the shadows ignored his question. "I suppose he might not have done it on purpose. He's not nearly as smart as he'd like to think he is, you know. He always has believed that Freddy Krueger somehow fed on the fear of his victims. But that's not the case at all. Did you get a chance to study the history of the Elm Street kids? I mean, really study them. If you did, then you'd have found out they all had something interesting in common. Did you know that little Nancy Thompson despised her parents, her whining alcoholic mother, and her sadistic cop father? Kristen Parker hated her mother too, because Mrs. Parker was a selfish, unsympathetic bitch who never listened to her suicidal daughter's cries for help. And Alice Johnson hated her father, another alcoholic. That's why Freddy came to them. He didn't feed on their fear. No, 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 Dr. Curtis. He fed on their hate." Curtis was still trying to focus his eyes on the figure in the shadows when he became aware of a dull pain that had begun to radiate up and down his left arm. He collapsed back onto the bed, blinking away tears which were filling his eyes. "If there's one thing Freddy Krueger could relate to," the voice continued, "it was hate." Curtis whispered hoarsely, "Who are you?" "I'm you," the figure breathed. Curtis could make out the sound of slow, shuffling footsteps approaching the bed, above the roar of blood rushing in his ears. "Are you starting to get the picture now? It isn't fear that keeps bringing Freddy around. It's when all that hate builds up until it's ready to burst. Once the threshold gets reached,
Bam! Freddy's back, baby! Because that's what Freddy Krueger really is. He's not a manifestation of fear. He's the embodiment of pure hate.
Curtis was suddenly aware of an oppressive weight that had settled itself onto his chest.
Aren't you wondering where Gordon is right now?
The voice asked suggestively.
You don't think maybe he's with Jane, do you? Gee, maybe they're consulting on your case. Maybe he's asking her what it feels like to be in love with a dried up old prune like you. Don't tell me you don't hate him. Oh, Curtis, don't tell me you don't loathe that son of a bitch for playing you for a fool.
I don't hate him. I don't. At last the figure emerged from the shadows. A hideously scarred face floated above Curtis like a child's balloon. Its eyes glittered insanely.
You're lying!
I'm not. The figure winced. Then its seared lips broke into a mirthless smile.
You and I are the only ones who know the truth. We're the only ones who know that as long as human beings keep on hating each other, Freddy Krueger can never die.
Blackness had begun to creep in along the edges of Curtis's vision. You're wrong, he rasped. I'd beat you. Someone else will too. Someday. The smile faded.
Too bad you're not going to be around to see it, isn't it?
Mustering the last of his resolve, Curtis snarled at the figure. Get lost, you! The figure winced again. Then it lifted its right hand. Finger knives wiggled in a gesture of farewell, the blades catching what little light was left in the room.
Nighty-night, Doc, the figure said as it began to dissolve back into the shadows. You may have gotten rid of me for a while, but I'll be back. I'll always be back.
As the figure slowly vanished, Curtis whispered, Fred, I love you. Just as the pain in his chest became excruciating. Then gradually it began to fade. The comforting blackness enveloped him like a cocoon. In his mind he could still hear the mad figure's voice, repeating over and over,
Freddy can never die! Freddy can never die! Freddy can never die! Did I forget to mention? Freddy can never die!
You're wrong, Curtis told the voice commandingly, driving it from his brain with all his remaining force of will. He began to pray silently. No more hate, no more hate, no more hate, no more. He closed his eyes. His last thought was, I hope it's Neil and Jean who find me. He wanted them to be the ones to read the peaceful, knowing expression on his face. He was certain that they would be able to tell by his look that he died believing that someday, somehow, his prayer would come true. Someday. Okay, Slashaholics, this has been Le Morte De Freddy, from the short story anthology book, Freddy Krueger's 7 Sweetest Dreams. This makes number 4 that we've done on the channel. There's 3 more to go. And I'm going to let you subscribers vote on what will be the next one I do. I knock these out randomly, just as little surprise uploads. The 3 that remain are called Asleep at the Wheel, Miles to Go Before I Sleep, and Dead Highway Lost Roads. So, in the comment section below, I'd love to hear what you guys thought of tonight's story. But also, let me know which story you want to hear next based on those titles. Again, Asleep at the Wheel, Miles to Go Before I Sleep, or Dead Highway Lost Roads. And whichever story gets the most votes will be the next one I do on this channel. Guys, I gotta say, I enjoyed catching up with Dr. Gordon after the events of A Nightmare on Elm Street 3. I was intrigued by the whole time travel aspect, by hypnosis and dreams and all that. but I gotta say, it felt like the story dragged on a bit longer than it needed to. But that conclusion was wild. Wild conclusion. I wouldn't say this is my favorite or even my second favorite so far, but I didn't hate it, and I did not enjoy it. I really enjoyed reading it. I thought the story was a bold idea. I think that it was fleshed out decently, but I felt like it kind of dragged out in parts that wasn't really necessary. Kind of left me wondering if he actually time traveled at all, or whenever he got put under, if everything that happened from the moment that Dr. Gordon put him under, if that wasn't just a dream, and Freddy killed him in that dream by making him age and all that. Who knows? We'll never know. The story, is a standalone story that was written back in 91. But that's my thoughts on it. I would love to hear all of your thoughts on this story in the comments section. I love discussing these books and short stories with you. And guys, I also want to let you know that tonight's upload was brought to you by our patrons over on Patreon: Carl Eakins, Catherine McClear, Sean Campbell, and Cecilia Spears. And if you would like to become a sponsor of the 80 Slasher Librarian YouTube channel and help keep this channel going for years to come, then go to the link in the description below to the Patreon page and sign up for as low as $5 a month, guys. That's it. Just $5 a month can help this channel grow and become bigger and better as time goes on. And you'll get some awesome rewards for doing so. Check it out. And until next time, this has been your friendly neighborhood 80 Slasher Librarian saying, thanks for listening, and
pleasant scream!